Architecting for Azure with Greg Leonardo.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results. They are hiring architects as well as .NET engineers who'd like a path to become an architect. You can go to clearmeasure.com/careers for that. And my guest today on the show is a repeat guest, Greg Leonardo, and he's back again. And Greg is a cloud architect that assists organizations with cloud adoption, innovation, and is currently a public cloud architect at AT&T. He's been working in the IT industry since his time in the military and is a developer, teacher, speaker, and early adopter. Greg has worked in many facets of IT throughout his career and is currently the president of TampaDev, a community meetup that runs #TampaCC and various technology events throughout Tampa, Florida. Greg holds a certification as a Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert, also a Microsoft Certified Trainer, and is an awardee as a Microsoft MVP, which stands for Microsoft Most Valuable Professional. Greg, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks, sir. Doing great.
Awesome. Well, you were last on the show in episode 91, and surprise, surprise, we were also talking about the latest in Azure on that episode, so listeners can go back to episode 91 and check that out. But since then, it's been about, a little over a year and a half or a little bit more?
About a year and a half.
What's changed since then? And we'll let the listeners go back and listen to that show.
Well, there's been quite a bit. I mean, a lot of new technologies have surfaced in Azure, but I still believe businesses struggle with how to manage cost in Azure, even with all of the new things that are coming up. So I still believe that's going to be one of those things that will ride off into the future with that you and I will still probably battle within the organizations.
Hey, good point. You know, I don't know that there's been a single customer where that question hasn't come up, or even a single system, my own subscriptions for various products where it's like, oh, wait, the bill is on track to get that much. Okay, let's adjust something.
Right. And it's a bit disingenuous to just look at the bill and always go, well, you know what? Maybe there's something we need to do, because sometimes there's a cost involved with offloading your workloads to any cloud platform, right? Especially Azure. So understanding what you're getting rid of and the soft cost behind that will sometimes help you realize where that cost structure is coming to play, right? So a lot of organizations don't realize the cost benefits they're getting from not having to support different facets of things, like going from a VM to a PaaS-based service or a serverless function, right? You no longer have to manage the VM. You no longer have to take care of any of that stuff. So I always view Azure like a zoo, right? Some animals that you have are going to require more attention than other animals. So it's kind of that thing that you have to really understand. And then when you do that, you're able to start looking at where your cost is and start identifying where that cost isn't making sense for you. Like having multiple instances of something that's not a critical application, and then in turn having to pay for both of those rather than using an auto scale, or not being able to use auto scale on your services because you didn't design them to be stateless or be able to scale on their own. So you have to make them really, really, on big pieces of resources in Azure. So, there's just still a lot of work left to do for organizations to realize what Azure and cloud native applications offer them.
Yeah. Now, with your current role, as I understand it, and of course, just having been doing this type of work for so long, you're not just individually, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not just individually building applications by yourself or in a small team. And as a Microsoft certified trainer, you're helping, but you're actually setting guidelines and helping many teams use Azure effectively. What is that mind? You are an Azure architect, not just of an application, but of many teams. What does that mindset look like for you?
The mindset has always been a struggle to me because I think a lot of people look at roles as being, you have to be in control of something, right? And the biggest thing you have to learn as an architect is you're not in control of much, right? At the end of the day, you find the opportunities in Azure, you develop the guidelines for folks to use, and then you have to evangelize and sell that to the people that sit downstream. So you're not always the champion of what you want to do. So you have to learn that the mindset is to empower folks in order to get their job done versus telling them how to do their job. And I believe that's where a lot of architects in both old age and today have really cut themselves short, is by looking that, they have to sit in that little tower and say, hey, I need you to do this, that, and the other thing, right? Rather than giving folks the freedom and the guardrails to discover the things that they need to do on their own. And, supporting not only their vision, but them using your vision to get down to the end of the street. That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of dive more into those topics we've already discussed, but for those who just don't know, or maybe haven't looked at certifications in a while, what does it mean? What the heck is a Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert?
Well, it's pretty much the jack of all trades knife, right? I mean, there's a lot into it. When I took the exam, I took 300 and 301. My very first 300 exam came with a lab section to it too, that I believe they removed from the overall certification process. But I had to answer standardized questions, and then I was given a lab to solve problems. Mm-hmm. So it was a very difficult process to go through, especially the lab, because it was a bit more subjective. You never knew what you were going to get there. So it's not like you could prepare yourself. So you had to kind of round yourself around to kind of make your way through that. Then I took the 301, and after taking the 300, the 301 was cake. Okay. It was like 75 questions of, multiple choice, way simpler than the lab section. So, but basically it's a jack of all trades. And really what I view it as is somebody that can, when you look at it, I always use the football analogy, right? Why a football coach can go to different teams, because he has a fundamentals of what he teaches everybody, right? That's basically what you have to have. A fundamentals of Azure, understanding the operations side, the development side, and the DevOps side of the house for doing deployments and automated things. So it's really kind of an orchestration between all of those, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you said the 301 was cake. For somebody who's done so much Azure work as you, maybe it was cake. not one of the first ones to go for.
Exactly. Well, it's kind of one of those things that, I think you and I discussed this a while back, so we'll share it again with the listeners. But, I grew up and worked myself through the operations side of the house. So I started out at a help desk, worked my way up through network business analyst. I wrote some applications in order to automatically program things. Then in turn, that got me down my development career that I went and developed applications. Then I moved over to the architecture role. So I've kind of been through the breadths of both sides. I not only can build a server, but I can also program it as well. So it's definitely a mindset that folks have to get into. But I think the biggest thing that I can impress upon architects is you're not always in control of your own destiny. While you can put the guidelines and the governance and the suggestions around it, you're really attuned to the folks that you're trying to, move in that direction. Because not always do you get to dictate what a role is going to be. And I never liked the idea of dictating something simply because you take away creativity and innovation at that point, right? Mm-hmm. You never know where a good idea is going to come from. So never put yourself in a point where you can't hear what that good innovation is coming down, or somebody may see something different.
Yeah. Anyone I talk about who's doing a lot of work as an architect, I like to ask, what's your favorite diagramming method or diagramming tool? Because anytime we design something, we need to communicate it. We're going to have to draw something in some form or fashion. So what's your favorite method currently?
I use whiteboards. All right. Believe it or not, I'm the old school guy. I would much rather sit down and draw it on a paper napkin than look at it from a fundamental perspective. Because what I've found in my history is a lot of people get caught up with aesthetics and they lose the message of what you're trying to do. So when you take the aesthetics away and you use boxes and other different things, you don't get those folks that squirrel when you're trying to explain how you're trying to get to a point. That makes sense.
I like to keep answering that question because I get asked so many times, oh, what about this new tool came out? What do you think? And so many times doesn't freaking matter. Just draw the diagram.
Yep.
Don't waste extra time or risk not getting it done or not doing it. Just convey the idea. So that's good.
Or spend hours to find that perfect icon that you wanted to put in your diagram. So to explain what you're trying to do. I mean, when diagrams take longer to put together than the design docs, you're probably in the wrong bit, right?
Yeah. There you go. I got to say, the smartphone cameras of today, just taking a picture of a pencil drawing, and then the latest Surface and Pen, I kind of like it. I mean, just drawing things and then exporting it to a PNG.
Yep.
So
unfortunately, I had to go the older school route at AT&T. I actually have a MacBook that I plug in my iPad Pro to, and I draw my iPad Pro.
There you go. Yeah, the iPad Pencil is pretty phenomenal as well.
Yep.
Nice. Okay. So can I go back to one of the first things we spoke about, which is managing costs? All the Azure services being consumption-based, it's, estimate this, estimate that. But still the question lingers, okay, I'm going to design it. What should I expect the bill to be? How does one go about making decisions and projecting what the monthly bill is going to be for a given application?
Well, let's take the elephant in the room and throw it out there. Most businesses are not going to go on consumption based. I don't know. You probably worked at as many large organizations as I have. Consumption models are thrown right out the window because they're not predictable. So what you run into is a predictable cost model that most organizations still can't get out of the way. However, there are some caveats to that. And I'll give you a for instance. We use a lot of private endpointing at AT&T. So one of the big issues with that is we can't use some of the consumption-based model that's in Azure because that model doesn't support private endpoints and network isolation. So when you look at large workloads from large organizations that move to the cloud, these workloads tend to want to be more isolated than your standard small mom and pop businesses do. So you don't get to use all of some of the fancy pricing models that you have in Azure. So it becomes a little bit more predictable.
Are you talking about just sticking with VMs, or what are you saying?
No, what I'm talking about is using something like serverless in a consumption-based model, right? Where you only pay for what you use. A lot of those models don't, like from a serverless perspective, you can't use consumption-based because it doesn't support private endpoints. You either have to use premium or an app service plan in order to overcome that. So your cost model goes up a little bit versus what it would be if you were under the consumption-based model. So, but a lot of that can be kind of gotten around with Microsoft is if you have more of a predictable model, you can get buy downs for your things. Like last few organizations I worked at got the P3 V3s bought down to where they were 60% of what they were. So the cost model was the same as like an S1 or S2. So you've got to look for the opportunities to do that. But what ended up happening, right, is you then got that little disingenuous side where now you had these smaller apps that had these huge resources assigned to them. And, that because you were paying much less for those huge resources, but they really weren't being used at all. So you've got to find that happy balance, and especially with larger organizations. I look for every opportunity to use more of the utility or consumption-based model, which is I pay for what I use. It doesn't always fit the mold when you look at security or larger organization, workload isolation risks and things like that. So,
okay. So then when you talk about the isolation and the predictable model, are there certain services that fit those needs better than Azure Functions, or which ones are you specifically talking about that tend to get used more when management says, nope, I'm going to give you your budget and that's it?
Well, generally what I try to stay away from, and this is just me, when you start talking about VMs in the cloud, they become very costly because they're not a cheap resource, not only from a compute perspective, but also from a support perspective, because you still have to support the OSs, right? So then after that, you've got, Kubernetes or containers, which is the same point. They give app boundaries, but you still have these infrastructures to manage that are behind the scenes. And then sometimes you can get to container instances where you take that out. So I generally look for opportunities that, one, I can limit my app team's exposure to the things that they have to take care of, right, as best I can. Because again, I look at things in Azure like a zoo, right? You have to take care of everything that you put out there, right? So you want to make sure that whatever you do out there is the least amount that you have to take care of, so that in turn you drive down your overall cost, both from a hard cost perspective, but also a soft cost perspective, which is your supportability and all the things that you have to do from an internal perspective. When I go down to something like serverless, you only have to maintain the code and configuration, right? You don't have to maintain the things around an app service and all the networking components and all of those different things. So there are things that are give and takes in these different models.
So does that mean you do like app service, or app service is more difficult?
I try to err on the fact of, if I'm ever building a service, I try to start out in the serverless arena, and then I move up from there. I go to PaaS, then I go to container, then I go to IaaS. But it all depends on what I'm trying to solve or any boundaries that I have to put up from a security perspective. Okay. And especially like cross-cloud. You use containers most for cross-cloud because you can isolate your app services and then deploy them in each one of the clouds without having to take, too much of a hit on redesigning each. So it really comes down to looking at the whole landscape of what the organization is looking to support, so that you can kind of weigh out where you want it to sit. Serverless on most platforms is very specific, whether it's AWS or Azure. You have Lambda on AWS and you have serverless functions in Azure. Both of those aren't developed the same way, and they're not managed the same way. So if you were to do serverless and had to support both platforms, you now have two code bases you have to support.
Gotcha.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
Are there a small handful of services that, after making all these decisions, you look and say, man, 80% of the time we're using these 5 services?
Yep.
Like what are your most common animals in your zoo?
My most common animals in my zoo are the big gorillas, the VMs. Then it goes down to PaaS-based services. Then we start looking at SQL managed.
Which PaaS-based services?
Websites or web apps are probably the biggest, because they look at it both from a web UI front end and a web API or microservice middle tier. So we've kind of got that happy balance between those in most of those arenas. And generally what it is just tearing apart the VM and taking out all the services and web code and just deploying them into a PaaS service to get rid of that VM when you can.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, and then data?
Data is usually, we do a lot of Oracle based, so it really depends on how big your organization. If you're SQL, you can kind of stick with SQL MI or SQL Azure, depending on where you want to go, even down to IaaS. But when you start talking about Oracle and Progress SQL, you've got a bunch of things that can either be PaaS based or instance based. So there's twofold there, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay. I didn't hear any of the new ones like Graph or Cosmos or.
Well, Cosmos DB is like anything else. The MySQL for a large amount of organizations, we probably have, I'd say, maybe around 2% of that being used, simply because the no schema databases are a bit rough for organizations to do because of the enterprise data model. I mean, enterprises have built their whole data model so that they can consume things and build reports off of them, right? So the enterprise data model becomes very important. And this goes back to the same point when we talk about microservices, right? By definition, microservices are isolated autonomous functions of code, right? And the big problem of organization adoption of microservices is the fact of the enterprise data model. How do I get these little services to provide data to my big data model so I can consume it for reports and all that other stuff? So, when you look at that from a business perspective, the enterprise data model kind of shrinks what you're able to do from a schemaless perspective, because usually those are JSON-based objects or document-based objects that don't lear itself to building out reports with or Power BI things or things for an organization. So generally, on the schemaless side of the house, you generally see those in invoicing systems or stuff like that, where they're just storing documents, where the metadata is more important than the actual document, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting point, that even if there is an application that kind of just invents a new way to store data, and whether it's putting it in blobs or JSON or document database or whatever, in order to interface with any other system, it kind of ends up back in a table with referential integrity structure.
Yep. You can't get rid of transactions. The transactional data is the thing that organizations build their reporting structures off of, right? It's not just data that's thrown out anywhere. Even if you see these large data stores with petabytes of data, there's still a workflow that's built into why it's there. How many people are coming to your website? What is the thing that's being clicked on? You have all of these different things that are workflow based that are much more transactional than not. So that's kind of where you see that you keep falling back to that point, because the enterprise data model is the biggest thing that's key to a lot of these larger organizations.
Yeah. And as I was thinking, there's so many websites where you can have a button that says export to Excel, which is tabular. I don't really see a whole lot that says export to JSON blob.
Yep. It is what it is at the end of the day. But, the thing that's amazed me is what people and organizations today are just doing with data, and how the data mining is coming out of that, which is kind of, taking that enterprise data model to the next level. So it's definitely interesting. And especially when you start looking at machine learning and running AI algorithms against it, and looking for those opportunities and verticals for organizations to expand their product base. It's just amazing.
Yeah, isn't the data analysis and data science, isn't that the epitome of history will repeat itself? You're looking at the past and you're making a future prediction.
Exactly. And it's kind of one of those things I think that we stumble around as a whole, is being able to look at what history teaches us, if that makes sense. Because there's always going to be a point of being taught by something that happened in the past, and especially that's data related, right? Because, and then we have to look at the context of why we brought in that data or why we viewed that data, because it's very important to look at what was happening around, i.e., what's happening globally, what drove this thing up, what was happening around the area, what was the weather like even around areas, because there's a lot of different data that has to come into these structures to really understand the context of why that data went that way. Why did a whole lot of people buy convertible cars in this area? And these are things that businesses ask themselves on where they ship to get their supply chains or their shipping chains into really good spots, so that they can predict where these cars are going to be needed, so they don't have to move them around, let's say. As just an example. So it's really weird on how.
Our Canadian listeners are saying, oh, who's ever going to buy a convertible? What are you talking about?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll remind everybody, you're in Florida. So convertibles, I'm guessing, are everywhere.
I just put a convertible top on my Jeep, so we're good.
The soft top. Yeah.
Yep.
Nice. Well, in the summer, those soft tops don't hold in the air conditioner very well. Might as well put them down.
Exactly. Well, that's why you take all the doors off and everything. So if you remember when we grew up, man, what was AC? 55 down the highway.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, the flip around the triangle window in the truck to suck in the air.
Exactly. That was your air vent back in the day.
Yeah, it is. Or just pedal the bicycle faster. You can get some more wind on you. So with the few minutes we have left, going forward, Azure is not slowing down. There's new services being introduced all the time. I want to get your take on some of the new ones and where it's going. So Azure Container Apps, what is your thought about that?
Well, it definitely, I think even Azure is an evolution, right? So when you come in and look at, you had Kubernetes and you had all these things that you had to manage, right? Clusters and things like that. The container instances now come up and they kind of pull that out of your face. So it's almost like a serverless Kubernetes, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
So now you don't have to worry about the infrastructure underneath it. You can just worry about the container. So I think at the end of the day, Azure is going to head to the point that is like a lights or an electrical outlet in your house. You're just going to plug your app into Azure and it's automatically going to work depending on what it is. And I think that's the direction that we're heading, because when you look at compute as a utility, that is the general piece. That is the good stewardship that we look for in the future, is how to share those cycles with everybody so that we're not building things that we don't need.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Okay. Any other, I guess, services that have been announced this year that you're really keeping an eye on that seem really interesting to you?
Well, they hit with a couple where, the Azure firewall was definitely a good ad in the past year, where it started taking off because it gave us better options about having to buy our bigger appliances. As far as, there's a bunch of things coming through Azure that I think, but I want to see how they play out from an organization perspective to see where that digestion comes from, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Azure releases a lot, but whether an organization can consume it takes a bit to see where that's going to tailor out.
Yeah.
Even container instances. Because right now, container instances, we are not able to use. They're currently on our block list. So you've got to look at where some of these are going, because you have to look at where the attack planes are, right? So a lot of organizations have definite risk factors when they look at what public services are available and how to isolate their workloads. So if something's not quite there yet, or somebody has a different method for attack planes, then they tend to take a little bit longer to adopt, if that makes sense. I know we ran into it with things like Power Apps, right? Power Apps has a lot of wildcard URLs in the back end that it needs to access, right? If you view that from a security plane within an organization, you start realizing that you can't have all of those open. So we actually worked with Microsoft to tailor that back down, because you can't, what was it? The Log4 bug that was introduced a while ago.
Log4j.
Yeah, Log4j. That's the same problem, right? When you have these things open to where somebody can manipulate one of the attack planes, you can create a problem that people don't realize and that is automatically propagated through a lot of the different services that are already there. Mm-hmm. So, the Azure is definitely taking us down a path to be more cognizant of what we implement, if that makes sense. Yeah. So there's a lot going into it. So what I'm liking is how much Microsoft has taken an approach to looking at the security planes with a lot of these different services and not just keeping everything out in the open, if that makes sense. So there's been a lot around, tightening these things down, making the services much better, easier to access, but more secure, and those sort of things. So there's just a lot, I think, coming down the pipe. That makes sense.
With your background in ops and overseeing kind of the direction and guidance for lots of different development teams, is there a go-to solution, especially with so many more developers working remotely, where they're connected to some network, home network? You really don't know where they are sometimes. Right. And of course, it's been suggested, hey, just stand up a VPN service in your Azure subscription and then just have everybody connected. Is there a go-to solution that you have your teams use for just their own individual network security for their own computer when they're not in a corporate building?
Well, in the own computer, I always tell folks that they need to take their own networks into consideration. I'll give you, for an instance, I use Unify here at the house. I mean, I have a corporate network built out here in the house, multiple providers for going out. So if I take a hit on one, I can always still work. So I think a lot of people cut themselves short by not taking their own security into account, both from even a phone perspective. I mean, we haven't even talked about bring your own device, right? Mm-hmm. All of these guys bringing devices that are connecting the services on the inside. Yep. So for me, yes, I do believe a VPN and a secure channel is always there. I do believe looking at Intune and things like that in order to propagate down endpoint management, things like that, to ensure machines aren't affected is a really good start.
Do you have a favorite VPN?
Not really. VPNs to me are VPNs. I generally use like a Windows-based Azure VPN when I'm connecting to Azure because they're easy to set up. But generally, I try to stay with as secure as I can because you're limited to the devices you're connecting to, right, Jeff? You've got these, and I learned this about like OpenVPN and a couple others, that they're very CPU intensive. So you can't just say, I have a favorite VPN, because then you go to a client and their equipment doesn't handle that specific protocol because they don't have the horsepower on their edge devices to manage it. So it really, to me, is solve the problem as best you can with the clients that you have. And that may mean for folks like me and you, we have multiple VPN solutions that we have to use each and every day. It's not just a single one. I can't say it's Cisco or Unify because a company may not have a Cisco or Unify background. They may be something different. So you've got to kind of pick and choose where that is at. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't have a particular go-to because I tried to, it just doesn't work.
Gotcha. Awesome. Hey, well, Greg, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's always great to have you and for sharing your mindset for architecting in Azure.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.